and you're listening to the news on WBAI Pacifica Radio in New York. I'm Paul DiRienzo. And as Hurricane Dorian closes in on Florida, another Florida story is refusing to die. Forensic experts are gearing up to conduct a high-tech sweep of the grounds at a notorious Northwest Florida reform school where survivors remain convinced bodies of long-lost boys are still concealed. The Florida School for Boys, also known as the Arthur G. Dozier School for Boys, was a reform school operated by the state of Florida in the panhandle town of Marianna from 1900 to 2011. Throughout its 111-year history, the school gained a reputation for abuse, beatings, rapes, torture, and even murder of students by staff. Despite periodic investigations, changes of leadership, and promises to improve, the allegations of cruelty and abuse continued. In the late 20th century, former students who had been held at the school in the 50s and 60s began to share accounts of abuse that they had suffered or observed against students. They organized as a group who became known as the White House Boys. Another group in the segregated facility are known as the Black Boys of Dozier. More than 50 bodies have been found by forensic teams, more than accounted for by school records. An inmate at the school is Jerry Cooper, a runaway. Cooper was spent time at Dozier in the early 1960s. He recounts his harrowing experiences.
I had just turned 16 before I got there, and what had happened is I had a very abusive stepfather at home, and I had ran away not once or twice, but 3 times and got caught every time. And the last time the juvenile judge, Matty Farmer at the time, and I was in Orlando, Florida, Orange County, sentenced me to the Florida School for Boys.
Did you know about this school before boys? Did it have a reputation?
Absolutely. I knew several boys at my high school that had been there, and they weren't boys anymore when they came home. Believe me.
What was it like when you arrived?
When I arrived, Paul, I'm going to be honest with you, it was late in the evening after dark, and well-lit streets going in there, you know, on the compound. There was no fences around the school at that time. I had to go meet R.W. Hatton the next morning, and that's when I knew I was facing hell. I mean, I was pretty street smart, and after, you know, speaking with him, I knew it was going to be bad, and it was. It was terrible. When I got to his office, I sat outside, and there was 2 other boys sitting on the bench across from me, and I was looking at them, and they looked terrified. And I just leaned over, and I said, "Hey, buddy, what? Is something wrong?" He said, "Yep, they're taking us to the White House." I said, "Where?" He said, "To the White House." R.W. Hatton calls me in his office, and I sit down. And to be honest with you, Paul, you look at this man, even the whole time I was there, nearly a year, you never saw this man smile, ever. And then he started telling me about the rules and regulations. Every rule and regulation that he read out to me, he said was punishable by going to the White House. He says, and the biggest rule of all here is this. You know, we got niggers on the other side of the road. Let me explain that to you. When he said the other side of the road, when I went there, main road coming out of Marianna, Florida, you know, a paved main road, run right through the middle of the school. Now, I was on a side called the number 1 side, is what we called it back then, which was white. And the other side was called the number 2 side, which was black, okay?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We did not intermingle. We were not allowed to speak to a black. We were not supposed to look at a black. And the last rule, he said this to me. If you get caught talking to a nigger, that's exactly what he said, looking at a nigger, both of you are going to the White House. And that was a standing rule then, believe it or not. I only ended up, Paul, in the White House one time, and that was one time too many because I got over 135 lashes, and I took a polygraph to that effect against Troy Tidwell, who was in court with us in a lawsuit a few years back, and he lied and lied and lied, so I went and had a polygraph to show that the man was lying, and I passed the polygraph 100%, all questions. Had I received over 100 lashes that night? Yes. Did they make you tie a sheet and towel around your rear end and legs to keep blood out of the bed? And I said, yes. So, if you try to let me put it this way to you. You try to take on 100 lashes with a strap 2.5 feet long with a wooden handle on it and at least a half-inch thick, 2.5, 3 inches wide. It's hard to do. I didn't think I was going to survive the night. I thought that I would die before the night was out. They literally beat my nightgown and my underwear into my back, rear end, and into my legs down to my knees. And I did pass out, and I woke up on the way back to the cottage in the car, in the rear of the car, laying on the floorboard with a guard's foot on my back. And they helped me get into the cottage, back into the cottage. This is, wee hours of the morning, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. And I had to get in the shower, and I had to rip out, the cloth out of my wounds and try to get as much of it out as I could. The only thing they gave me was what we call, back then we called it state grease. There were just, these like fruitcake pans sitting on the shelves and by the sink, and it was Vaseline's what it was. We used that for our hair, or for a small cut, but that's all they gave me, and I needed stitching bad. I needed stitches real bad. I really thought I was going to bleed to death. My bed was still soaked with blood. I mean, pure blood the next morning.
Jerry Cooper was an inmate at the Arthur G. Dozier School for Boys in Marianna, Florida during the 1960s. Dr. Erin Kimmerle is a forensic anthropologist from the University of South Florida. She's part of a team that's been investigating remains found on the property. She says the trauma of the school stretches back to the Reconstruction era and Jim Crow laws of 19th century Florida.
Reform School actually opened in 1900 but closed in 2011. And several years before it closed, a number of men started coming forward who had been there in the 1950s and 60s and had been abused and had pretty similar stories of what happened to them. And that led to a number of investigations, both by investigative reporters and by the state. And something that came out of that was some information about a burial ground, boys who had died there and were buried. However, the whole everything around that burial ground, from who was there, what happened to them, where exactly they were buried, none of that was known. And so in 2011, I started asking for permission and going up there, permission was granted, to basically just document what is this burial ground and see if we could locate burials and figure out who was supposed to be buried there. And in doing that, we found more than what any of the state records or the state thought were there. And ultimately there were families, siblings even, and nieces and nephews and brothers and sisters of boys that had been buried there who turns out been asking all along what had happened to them and for information and just were never given any answers. So they wanted us to excavate and exhume so that they could be relocated and ultimately buried with their, parents and family plots and such. And so we sought permission to do that. That turned out to be a lot harder to get permission. It took about a year. Kind of a long story. It was not something that the state wanted to do. There was a lot of resistance in the local community, but permission was granted. And so we excavated. We found 55 burials. And since have made 8 positive identifications and about 15 more presumptive identifications.
What did you find? How did these people die?
Well, we have information from the historic record, some information from death certificates, newspaper reports, family statements, but in terms of like skeletal autopsy, the remains were not well preserved to verify or confirm anything based on autopsy. So what we know from the historic record, and those other sources I mentioned, is that there were a lot of boys who died after running away. They were found with injuries or found dead. It's pretty vague in terms of the specifics of what happened to them, but that was a common finding. There were a number of boys who died from a flu epidemic in 1918, and I always like to point this out because while, that was like a worldwide pandemic, what happened is that the boys who were black on what was a very segregated campus were left there by staff, and so state officials found them days later, starving without medicine or care, or water, anything like that. So even in these cases where there's, natural disease or a fire or things like that, you find a lot of problems with in terms of like culpability and who was responsible.
There was some resistance from the community. What was the source of that resistance to looking into this?
There was resistance. I'll say at first I felt very sort of baffled by that, and because I thought, well, this is a historic project. And I said historic because we were very focused on everything that was sort of 1960s and before, because that's when the burials were created on this campus. So, that was kind of the purview and scope of our work. What I learned very quickly is that the past is the present, and that for everyone who's involved with that institution, for the families who are involved, and certainly for the community in which it's physically located, it's as much a part of everyday life and an issue as it ever was. And so I think that part of it has to do with fear about how they would be perceived. How will the community, how will individuals who were associated with the school be perceived? They have a very particular story and narrative that the school has always put out. It's actually interesting. They issued press releases and hired people to do PR in like 1913, which to me I thought, well, when did people start using press releases, right? Like it never occurred to me that was really a concerted media strategy, but they had so much bad press because of the abuse that was going on and they didn't want to have the doors closed down forever. So they worked really hard to create a certain narrative. And I think some of that legacy exists, and some of it is this desire to see things through a certain lens. And I think a big part of it is that the core issue here has to do with race and also class, in terms of these were very poor families whose children were taken into custody. And so those issues are, as much present today as ever.
Dr. Erin Kimmerle is a forensic anthropologist from the University of South Florida. More than 500 former Dozier students have alleged brutal beatings, mental abuse, and sexual abuse at the school, which closed in 2011 after 111 years of operation.